Sup YouTube land. So today we're going to be taking a look at block sanding and colour sanding. What's the differences between them? And hey, should you care? So let's take a look at them. Righto, so block sanding and colour sanding. Is there actually any difference between the two? Well, yes and no. And no is going to be the easier one to answer first. No, as in they are the same technique, they are the same method. You are using a block. When I say a block, here's a few of mine. That's obviously for doing large panels, and then you have different sizes for doing different panels, flexible ones. You're using a block and you have your cutting medium on top of it, your sandpaper. And so you are block sanding because you're sanding with a block. Colour sanding is no different. You are still using the block, but the difference being it's when you're actually doing the method or doing the process during doing the paint job, and also the grade of cutting medium that you're using, the sandpaper that you're using. Colour sanding uses a much finer grade of paper, whereas block sanding, doing the primer work, you use quite a coarse paper to knock everything down quickly. Okay, so there's the difference between block sanding and colour sanding. They're the same thing in technique, it's just that where you do it in the paint process and the grade of the paper that you use is the difference between the two. Okay, so this is a diagram on a microscopic level. You've got your body panel, steel, GRP, carbon fibre, fiberglass, whatever it may be. You've got your primer on top of that, you've got your base coat and your clear coat. Base coat and clear coat if you're using a metallic or a pearl, because if you're using a pastel or a base colour like a red or a blue with nothing to it, then a lot of the time you can have those just be one and the same thing. Okay, so block sanding, you would use that on the body panel itself. Say it's been damaged and you've had to do some panel beading, you're always going to want to have to put a slight skim of filler on top. So there's your filler, you've gone over it, you block sanded it, everything's dead straight now. Brilliant. Then you go over it with primer, normally high build primer once you've done all your filling work. And this is quite a thick fluid, especially compared to the clear coat and the base coat. And because of that, it doesn't want to flow together. So if it flowed nicely, then you'd end up, however flat your body panel was, that's how flat your primer would be. But it doesn't work that way. So when you lay down the primer, you end up with the orange peel. And the reason why people call it orange peel is if you actually look at the paint on your car, it looks like the skin of an orange. So the block sanding is used to, again, flat the surface. So what you're doing is all of these microscopic highs and lows, you're basically taking the primer down to the lows or below the lows, but still leaving material on there, because otherwise you're just going back to bare metal and you need the primer for the other layers to stick to. So you do your block sanding, and hey presto, you end up with a primer as flat as what your body panel is. Then you lay on your base coat, and because of its viscosity, it's very thin, and normally it's a third or half made up of thinners, which is just a solvent, and so that it will flow very well. So it will come out, it should come out almost as flat as what your primer is, and then the solvent evaporates off and you're just left with the colour on there. So generally the base coat, you shouldn't have to do anything to that. And then you put your clear coat on. The clear coat's a bit thicker than what your base coat is. So because of that, again, it will flow quite nicely, but you know, you have to be very skilled to get a completely flat surface straight out of the gun. Most people, you're going to end up with still a little bit of orange peel. So again, you're going to end up with your lows and highs from your orange peel. And that's where you do colour sanding. Because the clear coat and the base coat are actually very thin compared to what the primer is. Not that the primer is particularly thick, it's still microscopically like quite thin. But the clear coat is even thinner than that. So two things, because you've already got a fairly flat surface and it flows quite well, it's not going to be as lumpy as what the primer was. But second to that, because it is so thin, you don't want to like wear through it, because once you've worn through it, well, you're normally going to wear through the base coat and ruin the paint job. So what you're going to have to do is use a finer grade of paper, and you basically sand everything down to remove the orange peel. And then you go finer and finer to remove the scratches of the paper until you then do a polish, and that's when you bring the shine back. Okay, so if you've done a bare metal respray, or you've at least taken it back and like block sanded it before putting the base coat and the clear coat on, then you should have a pretty darn good looking paint job. And you'll get that term people say with these kind of paint jobs, oh, it looks like you could dive into it, like the paint looks so deep. And that's because of everything being so flat and how the light hits it and comes back. That's what gives you the depth. But then what happens if you've got a $100,000 Mercedes? Well, sure, it's got like a nice paint job on it, but it'll still have a bit of orange peel. So you have the term of you go and have a paint correction done, or you can just go to a paint shop and they'll like colour sand it for you. Whichever, they're basically the same thing. The paint correction is normally maybe not going so deep on that and just getting rid of swell marks and scuff marks, but it depends how much you're going to like pay and to what level you want to go. But the difference being, it's a manufacturer's paint job, and they're churning these cars out like, you know, all the time, really quick. So they're not going to spend the time like if you did a bare metal respray to get everything flat. So what that means is that even if you colour sanded the clear coat to make that all nice and flat, the primer underneath is not. The primer underneath still has texture to it. So that's where you get the difference between an award-winning paint job where someone's taking it back to bare metal and having a colour sand or a paint correction done to your vehicle. It will never have the same depth as what a paint job done down to bare metal will. And the reason for that being is just how physics works and how light works. And so quite simply, got your wee eyeball up here, and the light is coming down. Some of it gets refracted off of the nice flat shiny clear coat, but then some of it goes all the way through and it hits the base coat, and also some of that light does actually go through and hits your primer. But don't forget, your base coat flows over the primer. It doesn't fill the gaps in. So it's a bit bumpy as well, even though the clear coat is nice and flat. And so on both, whatever light manages to go through your base coat, because your base coat is generally like slightly translucent, so the light will hit that and it'll get refracted because of the lumpiness in different directions. The same for on your base coat, because it's following the texture of the primer underneath it, so it gets diffracted in different directions because of the lumpiness. And so even though it's got a lovely flat clear coat, it's never going to be as good as if you did a bare metal respray, did your block sanding on the primer, and then did your colour sanding on the clear coat. Because your Mercedes, Ford, whatever, your OEM manufacturer's paint job, they're not going to spend the time block sanding your primer. And so if you look at some vehicle that has been colour sanded or paint corrected on standard factory paint job, it's always going to have like a bit of texture, even though it looks nice and like smooth. You can just see that like underneath the surface it's a bit wibbly. And so there you go. That's a bit of a explanation as to the differences between block sanding and colour sanding. They're the same technique, they're just done at different points in the paint process, and they use different grades of paper. That's pretty much it. And that is also why you have a difference between doing a complete respray and just doing a colour correction on a car. So yeah, so I hope you found that informative, helpful, and if you did, please like. If you like the channel, please subscribe, and share it with your friends. Like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you on the flip side.